44 this morning. Mark chapter 6, verse 30. And the apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while. For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat." They went away in a boat to a secluded place by themselves, and the people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities, and they got there ahead of them. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate and is already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread?" And gives them something to eat. And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go look." And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. And they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and breaking it up, looking up toward the heaven, he blessed the food, and he broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided up the fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces and also the fish. And there were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. I bring this morning, we're going to just cover this passage. We took a big chunk last week, but it was necessary to do so because of Mark's sandwich style that he does. And we looked at the connection between the sending out of the 12 and then the returning of the 12 and then the death of John the Baptist, and the connection that Mark gave us with mission and martyrdom and discipleship and death. And really, ideally, that whole section could be titled "The Cost of Discipleship." Not only as a result of the instructions that Jesus gave them as they went out to take this message, calling people to repentance, but also in reference to John the Baptist and the reality of what it was going to cost not only John, but Jesus and possibly others who followed in the paths of Christ, that may cost them their life in being the messengers of the message. But again, you can kill the messenger, but you cannot kill the message. It will continue to march on. And I bring you to chapter 6, verse 30, because we have the apostles' return, and we flow from that right into the next episode. And I wanted to spend time looking at this and just stay here because it's always intriguing to me the things that Christ says and does. I mean, when we think that we're thinking realistically, we think we're thinking on the right path, all of a sudden he reminds us, no, you're not. And for the disciples, it's really what he's going to challenge them with, because they're going to think, hey, this is very reasonable, right? We're just thinking realistically here, Lord. And Jesus is going to say, no, the problem is you need to think theologically. And that really oftentimes is the struggle for us, is to think theologically. I remember a professor once said to me, he says, every day is a theology test. And I'm always reminding myself of that. It truly is. Every decision we make, every time that we respond to something, even the smallest of things, it is a theology test. And it helps us determine what we know and understand of God. And we will find that the disciples do not understand Jesus Christ. They aren't going to understand Him even after this. They're not going to gain any understanding from this episode as they ought to have gained. And so when Jesus comes to them in chapter 6, verses 45 and following, walking upon the water, we find that they failed to gain from this episode, and therefore when He comes walking on the water, they respond in a way that they ought not to respond because they did not have any understanding. And part of it is because of the hardness of their heart. But this is a passage that is familiar to all of us, the feeding of the 5,000, but we advance a little bit further. So I just remind you of our overall outline for Mark's gospel. If we look at it as a whole, we have Jesus the servant is introduced in Mark 1, 1 through 13. We had His introduction, His forerunner, John the Baptist, His baptism, His temptation, and then we had the servant Jesus in His ministries in Galilee, starting in chapter 1, verse 14 through 8:26. From 8:27 and on, he's going to be aiming towards Jerusalem. But we looked at the beginnings of his Galilean ministry, 1:14 through 3:6. We have finished looking at the latter stages of his Galilean ministry, 3:7 through 6:13, and we now are going to transition as we move into his ministry outside of Galilee. And again, he's going to come into a final conflict. If you look with me in chapter 7, he is going to come into conflict with the religious leaders. 7:1, he says this, "The Pharisees and some of the scribes gathered around him, and when they had come from Jerusalem, and they had seen some of his disciples were eating their bread with impure hands, that is, unwashed." Here we're going to have Jesus, he's going to encounter the religious leaders, and he's going to talk about the issue of what is truly clean and unclean. And he is going to point out the issue of man's heart in verses 14 and following of chapter 7. But he is now going to move into Gentile territory, and he is going to spend some time in Decapolis and so on. And so we find this movement happening in this part of Mark's gospel narrative. He's going to move outside of Galilee, and eventually he's going to move towards Jerusalem. But he has to have this final conflict in chapter 7 first. And I bring you back to chapter 6. I want to look at the feeding of the 5,000. And I will see that Mark he likes these double episodes. We have a double encounter of Jesus on the water. We have in chapter 4, the disciples were in the boat. The wind was blowing. The storm was great. We said it was a tumultuous storm, and they were fearing for their lives in chapter 4. We are going to find them again in chapter 6, verses 45 through 52, again on the water. And again, they're going to encounter Jesus. Well, we're going to find two feedings. We have the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6, verses 31 through 44. And then we're going to have the feeding of the 4,000 in chapter 8. Now, it's interesting because when we come to these, I just want to point out some things for you, because oftentimes we tend to do this with Jesus, his teaching and his miracles and so on, is that we tend at times to look at them in the wrong way. And we are going to look at this as a literal miracle. I believe that it is, with the movement of liberal theology and the pushing away from the supernatural towards the natural, from pushing away from God towards science and man. There is this movement that had happened, and it affected the church, where there was a movement away from the supernatural element. And they began to then reinterpret passages and reinterpret things. And we'll talk about the influence of Albert Schweitzer on the next passage we will look at with Jesus walking on the water. But all of these had had influences on the church. And so even if we look back to the 2nd century, Gnosticism, as they looked at this particular passage, they looked at the 5 loaves and they reflected on them as being metaphors for the doctrines of the creed. And so the first loaf was the Father, the second loaf, Jesus Christ, third, Holy Spirit, and so on, the church, forgiveness. And this is how they taught it, right? And so instead of taking them as literal loaves, and they now look at them metaphorically, okay? And this is where we can start to see, even in the early days, in early stages of the church and its life, that there was this allegorical approach to the interpretation of Scripture. I hold to a literal interpretation, insofar the dictates of grammar and context and so on. Another way to look at this particular one is to look at it in the sense of that it is a moral story. There are some who have explained this not as a true miracle, but as a triumph of sharing on the part of the crowd. In other words, Jesus' selfless spirit inspires an outpouring of generosity from the crowd that suffices for the needs of all. In other words, when they see Jesus start to give, everyone else takes out their bread and fish and start to give. And there wasn't an actual miracle. It's just that everyone caught the spirit of sharing, and so therefore everyone started to sharing, and therefore no one was in need anymore. This interpretation makes the feeding into a moralistic story. When each shares what they have, there is enough for all. And this is a good moral principle. And we find this in Scripture in passages like Acts chapter 2 and chapter 4. We find this open sharing in regards to the church. But this neither explains the purpose of the story, nor is it sufficient to explain the feeding. So just tell you that there are ways in which this story was distorted. We hold to be it as a true miracle, that there were literally 5 loaves, 2 fish, and God took that and expanded it, right? He broke it and He distributed and kept distributing until everyone was fed, until there was an overflow. And so we are going to take the literal approach as we come to this particular miracle. In chapter 6, verses 31 through 44, Mark follows the account of Herod's banquet with a banquet very much different. This is the banquet of Jesus Christ. And it's very fascinating how Mark compiles the information as he puts these episodes together. Not always following chronological order, but it's fascinating how he puts these two things side by side. It is not held in the fortress or a palace, but in the open air, rolling hills of Galilee. The invitation is not restricted to the important people of court and so on, but it is open to everybody. Jesus' compassion of the multitudes and the manner in which he satisfies their needs are dramatic contrasts of Herod's self-serving and deadly party. Just some thoughts as you start to look at this, and we will come back next week and I'll talk a little bit more about this particular miracle, because there are some fascinating parallels between this and the nation of Israel in the desert and Moses and his working, and we'll reflect on that a little bit this morning, but just to sort of drop some breadcrumbs for you for some further study. But it's interesting, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle of Jesus recorded in all four Gospels, the only one, which tells us that that is a significant miracle. If this is the only one that all four are going to cover, and the fact that it is so dramatic, and it's interesting because Mark, the way he builds, and it's interesting the terminology that he uses, it's a very short segment, but he really builds his point throughout this passage. But it clearly reveals that Jesus has great compassion for human needs. He is the supplier of these needs, and there are no ordinary sources that are sufficient. And we find that with the disciples, they're going to have just 5 loaves, 2 fish, and that's all they've got. And they're going to suggest these are the meager things that we have to offer, but Jesus is going to take that and use that radically. But it definitely emphasizes the authority of Jesus Christ over the natural world. We have already seen several miracles up to this point, and we will continue to see a few more. And again, I remind you that Mark, for the most part, compiles his miracles in this first major part of his gospel narrative. After 8:27, there's only 3 miracles that happen after that turning point. So Mark compiles all of them at this point to set the stage for the confession that is going to come from Peter's mouth that Jesus is the Christ. There is no doubt that when we look at this particular parable that it is important to all 4 gospel writers, but it is significant for Mark. And there are several reasons why I would suggest that this is a significant miracle in Mark's gospel. The first is its lengthy introduction. We have from verses 31 to 34, it sets the stage for what is to come. We also have the subsequent references to the failure of the disciples to understand the meaning of what took place. We have 2 particular feedings that happen, and here in chapter 6, another one in chapter 8, and following both of them, we get these responses from the disciples. In 6:52, it says this is after Jesus comes on the water. He's walking on the water. He steps in the boat. Everything is calm. They respond in a way which they probably shouldn't have responded. And here we have the statement in 6:52, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Because they didn't gain insight from the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus came walking on the water, they didn't respond to the situation the way that they should have. They marveled. They were surprised or amazed at what took place. Again, I remind you back in chapter 4 when Jesus calmed the wind and the waves, and they're saying, who is this one, right? So they're still trying to make sense really of the fullness of his messianic role. And in chapter 8, verses 17 through 21, Jesus asked this to the disciples, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and yet fail to see, or ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? For how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? He said to them, do you still not understand? We find then from Mark in his gospel narrative, these 2 feedings are very important, and even the response of the disciples. And so we realize that just as the disciples should gain some understanding from these, so should we. We should gain some kind of understanding from the feeding of the 5,000 as to who Jesus Christ is. The fascinating thing that I find as I read through the Gospels is, you know, I sit there and would think that at this side of Revelation, right, I would probably respond in a different way than the disciples do. But the reality of it is, I can stand in their shoes pretty well most of the time. And we'll find that even in coming to the feeding of the 5,000, we might respond exactly how they did and think that that would be the right way to respond. And Jesus is going to say, no, nuh-uh. You need to have a different perspective. So we have the introduction to the feeding starting in chapter 6, verse 31 through 34. We had the call of Jesus to come away with him in the first part of 31. So in verse 30, the disciples, and the apostles, I would translate this, the sent ones. This is the only time we looked earlier in chapter 3 where we have reference to the apostles, and that's only in a few manuscripts, and it is in the weakest attested manuscripts of Mark, and so therefore probably not in the original. And so this is the only mention of the apostolos in Mark's gospel. And because of that, I would suggest that this is not to be translated the apostles, but the sent ones. Because all the way through Mark's gospel, if you read it carefully, you'll see that the 12 is the official designation for the apostles. And again, this is the only time that he would use this designation, so I would suggest that it should be translated the sent ones. As they return from their mission, they come back, verse 30, they gather together with Jesus, and they report to him all that they have done and taught. And Jesus is going to challenge them to come away with him, but we're going to find the priority of Jesus in regards to his relationship with the 12, and we can see this by the repeated phrases that come in this passage. First in verse 31 and then in verse 32, and he said to them, come away with me by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while. Verse 32, it says that they went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. The same phrase occurs in the Greek text, although it's translated in both places, by yourselves or by themselves. And literally he says, come away privately, alone or apart. In other words, Jesus wanted to spend some time with them. And this is in response to the crowds that were coming around them, as we find in verse 31. For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. Jesus wanted to pull them apart, even in the midst of the hustle and bustle. The response to the ministry obviously is great. Herod heard about what was happening. More and more people are hearing about what is happening. They are flocking to them so much so that they can't even find time to eat. And Jesus says, you need to come and spend time with me. This is such a great time to stop and reflect, and this is such an important thing for us to remember. The gathering of disciples to Jesus means that in the midst of business and busyness, they are accountable to Jesus Christ alone. This is important for us to think about in regards to discipleship and being followers of Christ and carrying out the mission of Christ. What we find here as he gathers them to himself is there is a greater need to be alone with Jesus when there are greater demands. I take you to Luke's gospel. Take Luke chapter 10 if you would, please. Luke chapter 10. In Luke's gospel, Luke is going to lay out for us, and he's going to deal with the issue of kingdoms in conflict. And in chapter 10, we have two sections that we all probably know very well. The first one is the parable of the Good Samaritan in chapter 10, verses 30 through 37 of Luke's gospel. And it's immediately followed by Mary and Martha in verses 38 through 42. And we know both of these stories very well. Now it's interesting because this comes, the parable of the Good Samaritan comes on the heels of Jesus' discussion with one and talking about the law and so on. And we have the importance of the law. It's divided up into two parts essentially. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And the one whom Jesus is discussing this with, he said to him, and he asked him, who is my neighbor? Seeking to justify himself, verse 29. So Jesus gives the parable of the Good Samaritan. And essentially that lays out the principle of the kingdom that there is to be ministry and ministry for all. Now what's very fascinating is that as Jesus opens up the door with the parable of the Good Samaritan, that ministry is to be for everyone, right? And we should be reaching out and ministering to others and seeking those opportunities to be that Good Samaritan, to be that good neighbor, to minister in the time of need. At the same time, we have to realize that you cannot be so busy that you don't spend time with Christ. Hence the Mary and Martha incident. Martha is so busy in the kitchen doing. And then she comes to Jesus. Why don't you tell my sister? Why isn't she helping me? And Jesus says she has chosen the right thing. She is sitting at my feet, right? So I had a brother in ministry. He was ministering in a church in Chicago, a very large church, well known. And he was the youth pastor there. And he was in Russia teaching a course for 2 weeks at the Bible school. And he was talking to me one night and he said, man, I just don't have time to study and prepare to teach. He says, I have to be at so many meetings and everything is so required because I'm receiving a paycheck, right? So I got to put in so many hours in these meetings and conferences and all this stuff that he says on Wednesday night when I teach a youth group, I have 1 hour to get ready to teach. That's the only time that I have to study. And he says, and then Sundays, it's not any better. And he goes, and I'm hardly seeing my family. So I took them to Mary and Martha. You see, we can be so busy doing, and we can forget to spend time with Christ. With Christ and the disciples, as I take you back to Mark's Gospel, chapter 6, with all the busyness, right, and all the people coming and going, there was a need for them to gather together around Jesus and be alone. Ministry is good and ministry is necessary. We are here to minister. We are here to fulfill a mission, but we have to remember that we need to spend time with Christ. I realize that, if you're not spending time with the Lord and you're not growing, then you have nothing to feed anybody with. You have nothing to share, right? If you are not drawing from, the other side is that you can spend so much time studying, you're not spending time doing any ministry. A brother was a missionary. He says, I realize there are two kinds of missionaries. He said, there are those who spend all their time studying and no time building relationships. Then you have those who spend all their time building relationships and no time study. The trick is find the balance. Find the balance. We need to be about the ministry, but we also need to be spending time with Christ. So Jesus is going to call them to come to himself, and we find the reason for it in verse 31, for there were many who were coming and going. And it's interesting that Mark does not even use his usual term of aklos, the crowd or multitude. He just refers to many coming and going, and he shows the busyness of it. And it was so pressing that they didn't even have time to find an opportunity to eat a meal. And the reflection here, as Mark reveals it for us, is this was something that was usual. It was ongoing. It was persistent. We find the persistence of the crowd in verses 32 and 33. Notice with me. And they went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves, and the people saw them going. And many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus stepped out of the boat onto the shore, he saw a large crowd. They continued to press upon them. They continued to put pressure on them. There wasn't a moment in when they got any rest. And we find this continue to grow, continue to grow. And this is an important note for us to see in Mark's Gospel, because finally we're going to find, starting in chapter 8:27, where Jesus is going to start to draw the disciples away alone, more private. There's going to be more instruction in the home and in seclusion than out amongst the crowds, because now he's getting them ready for what they are going to face. But notice the response of Jesus in verse 34. Jesus saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. The first response, it's interesting. It's instead of anger, right? I mean, here we need this respite. Look, my disciples can't even get anything to eat. And we've seen earlier in Jesus' ministry, he didn't even have time to eat. Everything is so busy, and there's so many people that even his parents, his family thought that he was a lunatic because he was allowing these crowds to draw from him, and yet he wasn't taking any time to care for his own physical needs, the things that were necessary. And here with his disciples needing a time for rest and restoration, and Mark reflects in the Greek text a brief moment, not this long stretch, but just even a brief moment of respite. They can't even find that. And you would think then all of a sudden the crowds, they see them and they race to where they're going to be, so that when they finally get out of the boat, the crowd is already there to meet them on the other side. And all of a sudden you have them get off the boat, and you would think that there would be some sort of anger, right? Some sort of negative response on Jesus' part in regards to the crowds. But what does he do? He has compassion. He has compassion. I just remind you, Jesus always had time for people. I mean, how many times in our schedule, when it's so busy and so pressing, we want to get a little moment to ourselves. I need a little me time, right? And then all of a sudden, there's a pressing need before you. And how many times do we get exasperated about it? How many times do we get angered by it? How many times do we get frustrated by it, right? And we don't find that with Christ, right? We find compassion. Compassion. He saw the need, even in the midst of his own need. Something that's so amazing about him, isn't it? He in his humanity, and we don't forget that. In his humanity, he had needs like we do. He needed rest. He needed food. These are basic elements to human life, right? We need that. And yet, even in the midst of his needs, he was still willing to look and see the needs of others and forego his own. You see, I think I know Christ, and then I start walking through the Gospels, and I just go, man, I am so far. I am so far from where he's at. It's interesting because despite the crowd interrupts the much needed rest, Jesus and the 12, he looks upon them with compassion. And it's interesting because this term is used only by or of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. this particular phrasing. And sometimes I translate it good guts. NIV, I think, translated in regards to the widow of Nain that he felt compassion, or his heart went out to her. This is a deep movement down below. It's like when we talk about deep affections that come from the bowels, right? This is how they understood it. This was a gut level response. The amazing thing about this term, though, is it doesn't just merely reflect pity. It talks about actual action. How many times do we have compassion for somebody and we do nothing about it? Nothing. You see, then that's not this kind of compassion. Because see, this kind of compassion, you cannot remain immobile. You have to act upon it. Widow of Nain, here comes this funeral procession, her dead son. Jesus, he's moved so much that he stops the procession. He raises her son back from the dead and gives him back to his mother so she would have someone to care for her and be there for her. Jesus, so moved by compassion for this multitude, he is going to respond. He is going to act. But the reason for this compassion that comes is because he looks upon them and he says, they are a sheep without a shepherd. This is important in Mark's gospel. We realize this is an Old Testament picture reflecting the lack of spiritual leadership. We find it in the Old Testament reference to Israel. They needed these shepherds to shepherd the flock of God. We find that same imagery carried over into New Testament in regards to pastors. Jesus Christ is the chief shepherd. Every pastor is an under shepherd, and their responsibility is to shepherd the sheep of God. And their main role is to look at the role of the chief shepherd and follow in his steps. But here Jesus looks upon them and realizes they're lacking spiritual leadership. His compassion then is not merely about the physical need, although he's going to provide that for them. He's going to see that. His concern ultimately was for their lostness. Their lostness. He looks at these people and he sees a lack of direction, he sees a lack of purpose, and he sees a lack of leadership. It's interesting because when we look at this, the whole focus is on the feeding. But Mark wants us to understand this was an important aspect of Jesus' ministry. I remind you in chapter 1, he uses the term proclaim. From that point on, he talks about Jesus' ministry. It's always about teaching, 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 teaching. When we come to chapter 8, he is going to feed the 4,000. In chapter 8, he's going to talk about the fact that these people have been with him for 3 days as they have sit and listened to him teach, and then he is going to minister the need. But over and over, we find this focus on the teaching ministry. And this is so crucial for us to understand. And Mark wants us to get this. Relationship is good and crucial to discipleship. Absolutely. We need to be building relationships. But spiritual feeding is crucial. It is a key feature in any ministry. Far too often I sit and talk with pastors at times, man, and they focus on the relational part, and that's good, and they have all of these events going on, but you ask them, then what are you feeding them, though? What are you feeding them? You see, it's not enough just to feed the belly. You need to feed the soul. And that's what we find with Jesus Christ as he responds in compassion. So his compassion is expressed not by immediately responding by feeding them with food, but he's going to teach them many things. And it's interesting how Mark has a play on words here because he talks about the many paloi, and he's going to talk about the fact that Jesus is going to teach the many, many things. It's interesting because he's going to build off this term a little bit later, but first Jesus is going to feed their soul by teaching, and then he's going to feed their stomachs. The focus is on the physical feeding, but Mark does not want us to miss the most important aspect. And meeting the needs of others, it is the spiritual need. And I remind you, when we're discipling people, when we're reaching out to others, we see the physical need, and that is an opportunity to enter into their life and to minister to them, but it provides an opportunity for us to then come alongside and minister the word. If we never get there, then we're falling short of where we need to be. If God opens a door of need by someone's life and we walk into it, we need to understand that it's not just about meeting that need. It's about meeting the ultimate need, the spiritual one, and bringing the word to them, bringing the gospel to them. So before Mark even takes us to the incident of the people being fed physically, he wants us to understand that Jesus made sure that they were fed spiritually first. But I take you to the feeding of the 5,000. It starts in chapter 6, verse 35 through 44. The situation is laid out for us in verse 35. When it was already quite late, the disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate. It is already quite late." They were heading to a place that they thought would be secluded, where there wouldn't be crowds, but they found them, and they were there ahead of them, and then as soon as they approached the shore, they're there. But it's very fascinating. This is the third time in this particular episode that Mark talks about the distance or the remoteness of the surroundings. 3 times he's going to talk about this. And he's going to use the term in Greek, eremos. Now, I just put this thought in your minds, okay? Think back to the wilderness and Moses and the people. We'll make a reference to them in just a moment, but just think about that in reference to this passage. Are there any parallelisms between here and there? It's very intriguing as you read through this section. Notice the emphatic statement too in verse 35, how Mark makes emphasis on the issue of it being very late. We have the repeated statement, already late, that brackets this verse. And again, he plays off the word paloi, the many, the palos, the many things. Here we have pales, pale. It is translated here quite late. Really, it is much late. You see, it's getting dark. And we're in a desolate place, and these people got to be hungry. They have to have something to eat. And so the disciples are going to respond to it. And they respond in a way which we think, hey, this is probably pretty reasonable. And they thought it was reasonable in their response. So in verse 35, they make note to Jesus Christ that, hey, it's getting light. It's really late. We're in a secluded place. Verse 36, their advice, send them away so that they may go into surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Disciples make what they might think to be an eminently reasonable suggestion. This sounds like good advice. This is good practical advice. They're just giving expression to their practical instincts, and we would probably say the same thing. I mean, this is much more preferable, Lord, to have them go off, just to send them off, disperse the crowd, get them out on their own, make them go fend for themselves, have them go to the surrounding villages and so on, see if they can find themselves something to eat, because we have a crisis here. Things are going to escalate. If we just stick around here, we're going to have a bunch of moaners and complainers, and we're not going to have anything to provide for them. The disciples see a crisis arising, and they respond, and they think that this, hey, we're looking at this realistically, and Jesus is going to defy their personal instincts and their practical instincts by thinking theologically. How many times when we see a crisis coming in our life, we think what we think, hey, this is the reasonable response. This is just practical. This obviously is what we should do. And Jesus is going to say, no, 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 no. Don't follow your instincts. Think theologically. How many times we go back to chapter 6 when they send them out, right? And the instructions he gives them, take nothing with you, right? The point is what they were supposed to trust Christ. Here now they come to a situation after already being sent out and having to trust for the provision and so on, right? For their needs. Here they are again now presented with the situation when there is even greater need, and they've already experienced the provision of their needs before. And now all of a sudden here is the seemingly crisis before them, and how do they respond, right? They don't think theologically, they just think practically. And this seems reasonable to them. Let's just send them off. Jesus' response is he's not going to make this easy for them. Notice his response to the disciples, because he's not going to relieve the crisis for them. He's going to intensify the crisis for them. He's going to say, no, I want you to give them something to eat. I love this about Christ, right? I mean, here's this moment escalating, right? We see a crisis coming. And Jesus could easily just alleviate that. How many times in our life when we see a crisis coming, do we want him just to do something to alleviate, and he doesn't do that? He just seemingly makes it worse for us. Why? Because we need to learn something. We need to learn something. This was a learning moment. This wasn't for the 5,000. This was for the 12. And they were supposed to gain insight about Christ and his capabilities and his authority and his power and the way that he works from this incident. And because they didn't, when it came to the storm on the sea, they didn't respond the way that they ought to. If we fail to see this, then we will not respond the way that we ought to. I mean, they're in the boat in chapter 8, right? And they hear Jesus talking about the leaven, so they start arguing about the fact they don't have bread. Jesus is like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? I fed 5,000. I fed 4,000. You don't think I can feed 13? And I'm not even talking about the lack of bread. I'm talking about the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. I'm not even talking about food for the stomach. But how many times we reach a crisis in our life and I just sometimes got to think, God's just sitting there in heaven going, man, don't you get it yet? I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. Don't you think I can do this? Peter, right? He is the one who created the universe. Don't you think, if He created the universe, that He cannot create a way out of your problems and trials? This is why I stop and ask myself, do I even know who God is? I profess to know Him and have a relationship. But see, I respond like they do. I think practically. This is thinking things realistically. And Jesus goes, no, I don't want realistic. I want theological. Because that's really where the reality lies. You see, this is the deception of the world, right? Reality is only what you experience with your senses. See? It's only what you see, right? What's the saying? Seeing is believing? No. What does the Word say? Live by faith, not by what? Sight. We just see the loaves and the fish, and Jesus is going, no, you just got to see me. You got to see me. Elisha, right? When the forces are surrounding the city and his servant's like, Lord, what's going to happen? Look at this. And Elijah prays, open his eyes so that he may see. And all of a sudden he looks out there and he sees the myriads, right? He sees the Lord's army. All of a sudden now he's seeing what really is. Their minds, they were thinking this was reasonable. And Jesus goes, no, 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 no. This is not how I want you to respond. I want you to feed them. And in their minds, this is unreasonable and impossible. And I love this. I love this because they're so focused, right, on the things that are not important. And Jesus is just going to take their minds to another level. But it's very fascinating, the response and the parallelism that we often see back in the Old Testament. When you look at Moses and the nation of Israel, Numbers chapter 11, I love that chapter because here they are out in the wilderness and people are complaining. They're wailing. And Moses, things that Moses said to God, I'm just going, man, I would not say that. Are you kidding me? But that just shows the uniqueness of the relationship, right? That Moses was willing to say things he said. Numbers chapter 11, the people are wailing and crying, right? And he asks, God, who are these? I didn't give birth to these people. I didn't conceive them and give birth to them. They're not to be like me, nursing babes in the arms of me. How am I supposed to be responsible for them, right? Moses goes even so far as to say, look, if this is it for me, then just kill me, Lord, now. Get it over with. All the people are wailing and screaming. Numbers chapter 11, verse 13, where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they wail before me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. Numbers 11, 22, would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish of the sea were caught for them? This is after God tells, okay, Moses, I want you to have them all consecrated, and they're going to get meat. Trust me, they're going to get it. Not just for a few days, for a month. And it's going to come out their nostrils, right? And Moses is thinking, okay, you're going to provide meat, but where is it going to come from? I just took you across the Red Sea, right? Come on now. But I'm going to bring this meat. And Moses starts to object. And he starts asking this question. Well, even if we slaughter all this herds and all of this stuff, or even if we gathered up all the fish of the sea, how are we going to feed almost 2 million people out in the desert? How's that going to happen? And God responds, Lord answered Moses, is the Lord's arm too short? And then, in other words, is my power limited? You will now see whether or not what I say will come true for you. Does it? Absolutely. See, the disciples find themselves in the same position. They're looking at this situation. Jesus says, I want you to feed them. And they're just thinking, no way. This is impossible and this is unreasonable. I cannot believe that you're asking us to do this. Jesus is going to respond to the situation, though, in verse 38. And he asks them, how many loaves do you have? They're going to count out. He's going to go find out for me, verse 38. And they're going to say 5 and 2 fish. See, the disciples, their focus was on the wrong thing. They were focusing on what they lacked. Jesus focused on what they possessed. I just, when I think about this passage, I think of my dad. He's just been such an example in my life, and I try to follow in his steps. My dad is the eternal optimist. He just is, right? Oftentimes we might see the cup half empty. He sees it half full. Actually, he sees it completely full. We just can't see the other half of it, He's a little more on the visionary aspect, so he's several steps ahead of the rest. But he's always like that, right? I'll go to him, Dad, you see this, you see that? And my focus is on what I'm lacking and what I don't have and what I'm deficient in. I come and I bring the smallness, and he says, right? You got to see who your Lord is, and you got to see the bigness of who He is, and you got to see what He can provide. The amazing thing that's going to happen here is Jesus is going to take the smallness that they have to offer, and He's going to expand it by His greatness. It's just the beauty of life and ministry. That's when we realize the dependence that we must have on God, right? We're always going to be deficient. We always lack. We're always missing something. We're always going to be small. But we can take what little we have and offer to Him, and He can expand it with His greatness and use it in amazing ways to provide for others. And He provides for these people, not just in a minimal way, He provides in a sufficient way. They all eat, they're all satisfied. Not only that, but we have 12 baskets full left over. Focus was all wrong for the disciples, and so often the focus is completely wrong for us. Jesus sees possibilities. The disciples only see impossibilities. Because God can take even our smallest gifts and He can multiply them. He can multiply them. The issue is not whether or not we're willing to yield them up. And here's what's amazing about this story. The disciples don't understand. We can see that from the context. They're still not going to understand on the other side of this issue what exactly took place. But here's the amazing thing. They still obeyed. They still obeyed. Even though they didn't understand, even though they thought it was impossible, even though they thought that this command just was completely unreasonable, they still obeyed. They brought the loaves, they brought the fish, and they still distributed as Jesus handed out to them. And He was the ultimate source, but He did it through them. Is that not amazing? Even though we don't fully understand what God is doing, if we're just willing to give Him what little we have, and surrender it to His usage, it's amazing how He will multiply it and how He will use it to benefit the lives of others. We may not fully understand, but we need to just trust and walk. The disciples didn't get everything, but they were willing to go. I give you this thought: God is able to expand our smallness by His greatness. We need to stop looking on what we lack. You see, God, I just don't have enough. And we can take it, the principle, from food to anything else in our life. I'm just not gifted in this area, Lord. I'm not a great speaker. I'm not a great this. I'm not a great that. And He's all the while saying, I know, right? But just surrender this to me, and I will use it to magnify me, not you. The result of the response is pretty staggering. We have this statement in reference to the men, but Jesus is going to have them sit in groups of hundreds and fifties, verse 40. He is going to take the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and He's going to look up toward heaven. He blessed the food, and He broke the loaves, and He kept giving them to the disciples, reminiscent of the Last Supper that we will find in chapter 14 of Mark's Gospel. And He's going to set them before them, and He divided up the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces and also the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. Now this is an amazing statement because we have reference to the men. Men here is gender specific. The term that Mark uses here is andres. This is not like anthropoi, which can embrace men and women, children, and so on. No, this is purely just the males. There were 5,000 males. In Matthew's Gospel, he puts it this way: 5,000 men besides women and children. So in other words, there was more than 5,000 who were fed at this particular sitting, and they still had leftovers. 5 loaves, 2 fish. Give me what you got, and I'll do great things with it. Amen? Such an amazing lesson for us as disciples and followers. And I love it that they were satisfied and there was plenty left over. God will always glorify Himself. This is a simple miracle story, and it is a miracle story about the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. We don't need to read anything into it. There's so much spiritual truth here. We don't need to make anything out of each loaf like the Gnostics did. We don't have to do anything other than read it at face value and learn the truth from it and walk away from this passage with the great truth of who Christ is and what He can do. I pray that I'll be able to walk from this passage as my son Tristan did last Sunday when I finished preaching. I'm walking the office and he comes in behind me and he's talking about the message and he's talking about principle from the passage, but he so seamlessly applied it to his life. And I thought, would it be that I was like that, right? That I'm constantly hearing the Word and I'm drawing that principle out and I'm applying it. I pray that we would do that from here, that we would stop thinking practically, right? Following our practical instincts and start thinking theologically when we look at the situations in life. Stop looking at what we lack and more at what we have, and be willing to offer up those meager things to the Lord so that He can use them for His glory as He is carrying out His kingdom plan. Let's pray.